Welcome to the On List. Today we are comparing two classic Guerlain fragrances, one which is sadly discontinued, and they are Jicky, released in 1889, and Mouchoir de Monsieur, released in 1904. Now, these are unofficially considered by many collectors to be two halves of a single coin, and the reason is, structurally speaking, they are very, very similar. In fact, this fragrance was created effectively in reaction to the way this fragrance was being perceived by the public, in effect. So, without further ado, let's get into that. There's a lot of history here. This could be a long video unless I try and cut to the chase. So, the thing is, Jicky is very historically significant for several reasons, but the primary one is that this is considered the first proper abstract fragrance. So, fragrance that is not focused on a single subject of rose or of sandalwood or bergamot, or have a prescribed structure like a fougere, a sheep, something like that. Jicky is designed to smell like Jicky and only Jicky, nothing else. Now that doesn't mean there isn't a structure underlying. There is actually, for those of you with a keen eye and a keen nose, there is a fougere structure underneath of Jicky, kind of holding it up like a scaffold. People compare actually the structure of Jicky to Eiffel Tower, where it's very bass heavy and has no real heart, so to speak, just a top notes that plunge right into a very, very heavy bass. And that is kind of true in a way. You get a certain opening, and then a dry down hits, and that's it. You're in that dry down, and that's where you are, basically forever, until the fragrance wears off. Now, the second very historically important thing about Jicky is this is a fragrance that was the first to be of parfum concentration. So every past fragrance that Guerlain made was eau de cologne, including some other things that Amy Guerlain created, including Rococo, eau de coque. These were all colognes. So they all had a certain hygienic or grooming lean to them, dating back to the first works by his father, Pierre Pascal Guerlain. Now, Amy Guerlain created Jicky to remember an old school sweetheart he had. And the assumption was that this was a female, because I ain't gotta tell you guys, this is the 19th century. If you were any kind of queer, you were probably in danger. So everybody was in the closet. Very secret handshake kind of time period for anyone who wasn't perfectly straight. So Amy Guerlain's sexual preferences did come out in the laundry amongst the family privately decades later, you know, and after a while people said, well, hey, maybe Jicky was actually a boy, because he also gave his nephew Jacques the nickname of Jicky. So why would you give your nephew, who's a boy, the same nickname that you gave a supposed alleged female lover when you were a boy? Doesn't make sense. And it adds further evidence to why the fragrance itself was so popular with guys initially. Why the fragrance had a lot of materials and notes in it that were more conducive to the conventional taste of your average man back then than a woman. Think about it. Late 19th century, okay, 1880s, 1890s, all right? Prostitution was very rampant in most Western cities. There weren't laws to prohibit it just yet. As long as they kept to their own little, bordellos and kept the red light out and stayed where they were supposed to stay, it was all fine and dandy. So there was a lot of prostitution out in the open. And a lot of those women tried to cover the smell of sex with fragrances that kind of merged and helped mask. So we're talking very musky, indolic, skatole kind of smells. Okay, so ambergris, civet, ambers, all right, jasmine, clearly, ylang ylang, things of that nature. So those were not really preferred by the upper crust society women. They wanted the clean, the powdery, they wanted the effervescent fragrances, the ephemeral stuff that flicked about. So they liked rose, and they liked iris, and orris, and violet, and lilac, and sandalwood, heliotrope, things like that. Okay? Very prim, proper, staid, bound corset kind of, sort of thing. That's what they liked. So when you make a fragrance like this, which is lavender and spices and amber notes and patchouli and civet, you just know that the typical woman of that time period is going to look at this and go, oh, that's kind of scandalous. You know, it's pretty provocative. I don't know if I want to be caught dead wearing that, right? That's like, could get in trouble. I might smell like a fallen woman if I wear that. So a lot of guys were the equal opposite. They wanted to smell virile and masculine and in command, but they also wanted to be gentlemanly and refined and all that stuff too, because we're talking, you know, the dandy era wasn't high swing back then. So of course, Jicky became a really good alternative to something like Fougere Royale, which was a few years earlier. Fougere Royale took off with guys. Yeah, women liked it too. It was not technically gendered. Neither was Jicky. But this lavender-centric, musk-centric, patchouli-centric smell that relied very heavily on a coumarin undertone was more men than women at that time. Now, things would eventually change into the 20th century, and it became more prominent for women to wear spices, ambers, musks, things of that nature. Then the tide began to turn, and more women started to wear Jicky than men. Although there were plenty of noteworthy, very popular, successful men throughout history who continued to wear Jicky as a signature. One of the most famous being the late Sean Connery. Sean Connery went so far as to be featured on ads for Jicky because he was known to love it so much. Now, moving on to Mouchoir de Monsieur. This came out in 1904, 15 years after Jicky came out. By this point, Amy Guerlain had stepped down as house perfumer and had been replaced by Jicky, right, his nephew, Jacques Guerlain. So Jicky retained the services of his uncle. So even though Amy is not credited for it, he actually helped in the creation of Le Bleu. He helped in the creation of Bitsoku, Jetty, fragrances like that, all the way up to his death in 1945, okay? So he was there. He just wasn't really the main man doing the heavy lifting. It was his nephew, Jacques. And Jacques had a friend who remains anonymous in history, but he had a friend who was getting married. He wanted to bequeath his friend and his friend's wife a fragrance. So the problem was the wife wore Jicky already, but the husband liked the smell of Jicky, but didn't want to share it. So the solution was to make a new fragrance for the wife that she would enjoy wearing. And that fragrance became Violette de Madame, which is also discontinued. But Violette de Madame was made for the wife. And the husband got Mouchoir de Monsieur, which was Jicky but not Jicky. What he did was he effectively got his uncle, who had created Jicky, to sit with him and deconstruct the fragrance, to take everything out that was superfluous for a man's taste at that early 20th century time and get to the core of the fragrance. Basically take it down to a fougere. Get rid of most of the spices, get rid of the extra florals, all the elements that weren't needed. Get it down to its core. The citruses, the lavender, the geranium, the patchouli, the musk, the oak moss, the tonka, okay? That heart that a lot of guys at that time period liked wearing. That's why they enjoyed Jicky to begin with. So why not make a fragrance which is basically that essence distilled and all the rest of it is just cast aside. So for that reason, Mouchoir de Monsieur is a much simpler fragrance compared to Jicky. Jicky truly is an abstract fragrance. You can smell the fougere is in there somewhere. It's not like it's hidden, but it's definitely underneath a whole bunch of other stuff. Whereas in comparison to that, Mouchoir de Monsieur is very to the point. The lavender leaps out at you. The geranium is right there in the mix. Patchouli is front and center. The civet is actually more potent. This is more animalic than Jicky. And a lot of people already criticize Jicky for being very poo-poo smell, being very scatological in smell. They don't like that. Well, if you think that's bad in Jicky, you might want to stay away from Mouchoir de Monsieur because this is way more in that direction. In fact, it wouldn't really be until the mid-20th century that this kind of animalic vibe would come back in vogue. Like, we wouldn't see this again until stuff like Moustache by Rochas in 49, or Monsieur de Givenchy, the original versions of that, Monsieur Lanvin in the early 60s, you know, Givenchy Gentleman in the mid-70s. You know, those are really musky animalic fragrances, very heavy on civet. So it would take a while for the market to kind of catch up to where this was in 1904. And of course, because it was originally designed for a specific person as a bespoke fragrance, really, it was not sold to the public. So one of the things that people often called Mouchoir de Monsieur was a secret Guerlain. It was a secret Guerlain. You couldn't buy it in a bottle, okay? You had to go to the Champs-Élysées boutique in Paris and actually get an empty bottle of some kind, a Lalique bottle or something, Baccarat bottle. Take it to them, have them fill it for you. And since they didn't put the flagon of the fragrance out where all the other flacons were for the other fragrances that you could also get refilled, you had to ask for it. They had to go to the back and grab it. So it was one of those, if you know kind of things. And it was like that until the 50s, okay? So it was the first men's fragrance by Guerlain, but it wasn't officially released as such. It was very hush-hush. Because remember, in 1904, there wasn't really a proper men's market. You had some barbershop fragrances that were sort of implied to be more for men. I mean, obviously, Lilac Vegetal, things like that. Eucharist by G.O.F. Trumper. Blended Bouquet by Penhaligon. These weren't things that women typically wanted to smell like because they were peppery and citrus and what have you not. So I'm not saying that there wasn't a men's market, but officially speaking, there wouldn't be one until Pour un Homme by Caron, declared for a man. Until that fragrance threw the gauntlet down in 1934 and said, this is for a man, but only for a man. Until that moment in history, there wasn't really an official man's market. So, and that was, what, 30 years after this was launched. And then, of course, once Caron Pour un Homme would come out, very similarly musky, very similarly lavender-centric, very similarly heavy on tonka. Not a proper fougere, however, missing geranium, missing a heavy oak moss accord, missing some key elements, but Mouchoir de Monsieur and Pour un Homme would often lock horns. Dandies would have a Pepsi Coke mentality. You had the guys who liked the MDM more and the guys who liked the CPH more, and that's how it was in those early pre-war days. And then after World War II was over and the men's fragrance market began to blossom more, then yeah, in the rearview mirror, Jicky had mostly become a woman's fragrance, and the only guys who were wearing it were, like I said, people like Sean Connery, and those who just wore it in secret and didn't say anything, clearly. People like Charlie Chaplin, he wore Mitsoku, he didn't care. he did not care. But a lot of folks who are very self-conscious about their masculinity, we're talking about post-war stoicism, post-war asceticism, you know, square jaw, short hair, let down shoulders, you know, just this whole mentality that pervaded the immediate post-war era. You know, a man was a man's man, manly man, you know, ate his cheeseburgers, played his baseball, you know, went hunting on the weekends, whatever. So those kind of guys weren't going to wear Jicky. They certainly were not. No sirree Bob. So that's when Guerlain said, you know what? Let's break this out. Let's stick it on the market. But even when it was released to the public, finally, and bottled in little square bottles, the initial bottles were square, it still wasn't widely enjoyed. And I feel like a part of that had to do with tastes. You know, we hadn't moved back into these fougere fragrances. The 50s was a very dry time for men's fragrances. I've already spoken at length about this. Guys were wanting sandalwood. Guys were wanting cedarwood. Guys were wanting very dry, citric, sour, aromatic sheep fragrances. They wanted stuff like English leather. They want stuff like Chanel Pour Monsieur. They want stuff like Moustache. They wanted stuff like that. It wouldn't be until fragrances like Brut came around and repopularized the fougere. That's when a market for Mouchoir de Monsieur began to finally materialize in the mainstream. And by that point, Guerlain had already issued its first proper man's fragrance, Vetiver, in 61, 59 in France, 61 for the rest of the world. But they had released Vetiver already, and then they had followed it by Abbey Rouge in 65. So at that point, they already had 2 men's fragrances on the market. So they're like, well, let's just break this one out of the vault and stick it on the market because we might as well. We might as well. Okay? So there you have it. Now, the true comparison of these. Well, honestly, you don't need to own both. This is an unpopular opinion, of course. This is a hot take. But I feel like if you own Jicky and you're okay with Jicky, you gain really nothing by buying Mouchoir de Monsieur. And most guys who were clearly happy with Jicky kept wearing Jicky anyway. I mean, they didn't even know that this existed, so it didn't matter. But this was made as a response to one person who was close to Jacques Guerlain, one person who didn't feel comfortable wearing a fragrance because his wife liked it. So right then and there, male insecurity is the birthright for this fragrance. So in some ways, that would continue being the fragrance's legacy. It would continue being the Jicky for men who can't wear Jicky or won't wear Jicky. Now, it wasn't marketed that way, but everyone in the online fragrance community who has smelled both fragrances knows it as such. Oh, that's just the men's version of Jicky. It's Jicky pour homme, right? And it's a similar tale in some ways. It's a similar tale to a lot of Estee Lauder stuff, you know. Aromatics Elixir, Aramis 900, right? Cinnabar, JHL, right? So give them different names. Don't put them in the same line or the same brand. So guys won't know any different. Works beautifully, right? Works beautifully. And one last thing about Mouchoir de Monsieur, reason why it was discontinued, I'm guessing, is that it just, the fact that it is a more animalic, more stripped down, bare bones take of Jicky, meant that it just was not really selling enough to justify making batches of it. Batches of this stuff sat. I mean, even after this fragrance was discontinued, it did not immediately dry up. It wasn't one of those things where the moment it got discontinued, prices went shooting up. No, nope. It got discontinued and it was still stocked at Guerlain. It was still stocked at Harrods and Selfridges and every other major department store that carried the full selection of Guerlain. You could still find it on the internet. You can still find it at discounters. You can still find it on eBay. It took a number of years for the most recent bottles, which this is among, by the way, the most recent bottles. It took a number of years before the most recent bottles finally began to go up in price. And it was a slow climb. You know, Guerlains were already heavily discounted back then. Not so much now, but back then, Guerlains were already heavily discounted. So you could grab basically any Guerlain you wanted for like 60 bucks. Anyone you wanted. Anyone you wanted, 60 bucks. Sometimes less than that. I remember my first bottle of Vetiver was 30 bucks. So anyone you wanted. So this one was like going around 80 and 90 bucks. So it was like 30 bucks up from most Guerlains at discounters. That told you right then and there, a little harder to come by. Okay, but not a unicorn. Now it's a different story. Now you're gonna pay like 300 bucks for this. Now this is like ram's blood, you know, on the altar of sacrifice. You're trying to summon Cthulhu or something with this fragrance now. It's ridiculous. And that's a reason why I doubled down that you don't really need this fragrance. You don't need it if you like Jicky. You don't need it if you like Jicky. Because you only stand to lose, since this is ultimately the more complex, more historically significant, defining moment in perfume history. This is a footnote to that history. I love them both, though, and I completely understand, as a counterpoint to the point I just made, devil's advocate here, if you will. I am the sinner devil. I'm allowed to advocate myself, but I completely understand if you have fallen head over heels, like the Tears for Fears song, for this fragrance, and nothing else will do. There is a very passionate, irrational, cannot be explained side to this hobby. And when you fall in love with something and that's the one, that's the one. And if that's you and this fragrance, then by all means, do what is necessary to make sure you have some. I understand it. But for the person who is not that emotionally invested in it, for the person who is just looking for the ballpark, they're not looking for a specific seat. They don't care if it's nosebleed section or not. They just want to be in there to watch the game. Get this. And the eau de toilette version of this is also technically discontinued, so this is also old stock. Nowadays, you can only get this in eau de parfum. They don't even make the original parfum anymore, which is depressing, because I have an old quadrille bottle of the parfum, the extrait, and it is amazing. It is wonderful, but they don't make it. Can't get it. So maybe they bring it back. Someone is going to prove me wrong. Oh no, I saw it for sale. If that's the case, that's the case. But as far as I know, just the eau de parfum is all you can get. All right, guys, that has been Jicky versus Mouchoir de Monsieur, Monsieur, whatever, potato. How do I rate these? Well, they are both perfect 10 to me. Like I said, they are two sides of the same coin. I love them both. I just cannot rationalize overpaying for this one. That's all. I can't rationalize it. But if price was no object, if we lived in a world where money no longer mattered, like Star Trek, they are equally as good in my eyes. They are both perfect 10s for me. And this has been the Unlist. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye-bye.